Hello, my friends. The Zelensky peace plan and the strategic bankruptcy of the West? The publication of Volodymyr Zelensky's so-called 20-point peace plan marks not a breakthrough, but a confession. It is the written admission that Ukraine and its Western sponsors have reached the outer limits of what narrative management can accomplish in the face of battlefield reality. What is being marketed as diplomacy is, in substance, a demand for Russia's unilateral strategic retreat at the very moment Russia is consolidating its strongest position since the conflict began. The plan itself contains nothing genuinely new. Its core elements, security guarantees equivalent to NATO's Article 5 without NATO membership, massive Western-funded reconstruction and reparations, accelerated EU accession, the preservation of a vast Ukrainian standing army, and the freezing of front lines under Western supervision have circulated in various forms for over a year. What has changed is not the content, but the timing. This document emerges precisely because Ukraine's military position is deteriorating faster than Western publics are being told. The territorial provisions alone reveal the unreality at the heart of the proposal. Ukraine insists that it will not withdraw from its current positions in Donbass, while simultaneously demanding that Russia withdraw from all newly secured territory elsewhere along the front, including areas where Russian forces have achieved clear operational success. The plan proposes a freeze where Ukraine holds and a rollback where Russia advances. That is not compromise. It is strategic fantasy. Equally revealing is the treatment of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Rather than acknowledge the obvious that Russia controls the facility and secures it militarily, the plan punts responsibility to an undefined cooperative arrangement, heavily implying U.S. administrative control. This reflects a broader Western habit. When unable to reverse facts on the ground, attempt to internationalize them in hopes of regaining leverage. Moscow has seen this tactic before, and it has learned to ignore it. Western media claims that Ukraine is making painful concessions are not just inaccurate, they are intentionally deceptive. A ceasefire freeze under conditions that allow Ukraine to rearm, reconstitute forces, and integrate further into Western military structures would function as a delayed war, not peace. Russia understands this perfectly. Moscow has already paid the price for trusting Western guarantees once. There is no strategic incentive to do so again. This is why the Russian response has been silence rather than engagement. Russia does not reject the plan loudly because it does not need to. The balance of power makes rejection implicit. The panic visible across European capitals stems from the same source. For 2 years, European leaders repeated the mantra that Russia was isolated, economically collapsing, militarily exhausted, and politically unstable. None of these predictions materialized. Instead, Russia adapted, restructured its economy, expanded defense production, stabilized its currency, and gradually seized the initiative on the battlefield. The contrast between expectation and reality is now so stark that European officials are quietly abandoning their earlier rhetoric. Public statements from figures such as Germany's defense minister and other senior European officials acknowledging that Russia has no intention of attacking NATO represent a significant rhetorical retreat. For years, the threat of an imminent Russian assault on Europe was used to justify massive arms transfers, economic sacrifices, and the suppression of dissent. Now, as the costs mount and victory recedes, the same officials are attempting to lower expectations and calm public fears. Dmitry Medvedev's commentary captures the moment precisely. The sudden sobriety of European peacemakers is not the product of moral awakening or diplomatic insight. It is the instinctive response of political elites confronting the possibility that their assumptions were catastrophically wrong. The Christmas season softening of rhetoric masks a deeper fear. Escalation at a moment when Western leverage is collapsing would be uncontrollable. Despite this, denial persists. European figures such as Carl Bildt continue to circulate selective maps and claims suggesting Ukrainian tactical successes, even when these assertions directly contradict statements from Russia's Ministry of Defense and observable trends on the ground. This behavior is not analytical, it is psychological. Western political culture has invested so heavily in the narrative of Ukrainian eventual victory that acknowledging Russian gains threatens institutional credibility itself. The financial dimension deepens the crisis. The European Union's commitment of approximately €90 billion through loans and guarantees fundamentally alters the nature of its involvement. This is no longer political solidarity. It is financial entrapment. These funds are not grants. They are obligations backed by future repayment assumptions that depend entirely on Ukraine's survival and success. As Viktor Orban correctly observed, this makes the EU materially invested in prolonging the war regardless of its human or strategic cost. If Ukraine collapses, Europe absorbs the loss. The United States does not. This asymmetry explains the increasing divergence between American and European risk tolerance. Washington can afford strategic ambiguity. Brussels cannot. The EU has tied its economic credibility to an outcome it does not control. Meanwhile, Ukraine's internal political legitimacy erodes quietly but steadily. Zelensky's extraordinary travel schedule, spending more time abroad than within Ukraine, resembles that of a leader managing alliances rather than governing a state. Elections are indefinitely postponed, justified by wartime necessity, yet paradoxically promised only after Russia fully withdraws under Ukrainian terms. This creates a closed loop of unaccountable authority, immune to domestic challenge and dependent entirely on foreign sponsorship. The emergence of alternative figures, such as Valery Zaluzhny, underscores this fragility. Presented as a national hero and potential successor, Zaluzhny's political positioning abroad contrasts sharply with the mythology surrounding resistance and sacrifice. The pattern is familiar. Elites rotate positions internationally while ordinary Ukrainians bear the consequences at home. At the strategic level, the war's trajectory is now shaped less by ideology than by material exhaustion. Ukraine faces severe manpower shortages, declining morale, and logistical strain. Western arms deliveries cannot compensate indefinitely for the structural imbalance in industrial capacity and demographic depth. Russia, by contrast, has adjusted to long-term conflict, integrating lessons learned and expanding production accordingly. Sanctions, once touted as a decisive weapon, have instead revealed the limits of economic coercion. The West weaponized sanctions to unprecedented degrees, normalizing their use as instruments of political discipline. Russia adapted, Europe absorbed the backlash. Now the sanctions regime is turning inward, fracturing alliances and exposing contradictions within the Western bloc itself. Zelensky's peace plan must be understood within this broader context. It is not an initiative born of strength, but of strategic exhaustion masked by rhetoric. It assumes that Russia will accept symbolic guarantees in place of concrete security, and that time favors Ukraine when all evidence suggests otherwise. Wars end not when one side demands peace, but when both sides recognize reality. Russia is operating from that recognition. The West, and Ukraine in particular, is still resisting it. Until that changes, until diplomacy reflects facts rather than fantasies, documents like the 20-point plan will remain what they are. Artifacts of denial, produced at the edge of strategic collapse. History does not negotiate with narratives. It responds to power, endurance, and clarity of purpose. On those terms, Russia currently holds the advantage, and no amount of paper diplomacy can reverse that fact. Every war reaches a moment when rhetoric can no longer outrun reality. The Zelensky peace plan, for all its length and theatrical presentation, marks precisely that moment. It is not the opening of diplomacy, but the quiet recognition that the story the West has been telling itself since 2022 is collapsing under the weight of facts it can no longer suppress. For more than 2 years, Western policymakers operated under a series of assumptions that now lie in ruins. They assumed Russia would fracture politically. It did not. They assumed sanctions would cripple the Russian economy. They did not. They assumed Ukrainian manpower, morale, and industrial support could be endlessly replenished. They cannot. Most importantly, they assumed that time itself was a weapon they controlled. It never was. Time, in this conflict, has favored the side willing to endure, adapt, and accept the costs of a long war. Russia reorganized its economy for sustained conflict, expanded defense production, stabilized its internal political structure, and recalibrated its military doctrine in real time. Ukraine, by contrast, was transformed into a dependent battle space, armed, financed, and directed by external actors whose commitment has always been conditional and transactional. The peace plan exposes this asymmetry brutally. It demands from Russia what Ukraine and its sponsors can no longer impose militarily. It seeks guarantees without leverage, withdrawals without defeat, and security without sovereignty. It speaks the language of victory at the very moment defeat becomes structurally unavoidable. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is not Russian ambition, but Western hesitation. Europe is financially entangled, politically divided, and strategically cornered. The United States retains distance and optionality, while European governments face the consequences of their own escalation without the means to control the outcome. This imbalance is already shaping behavior. Quieter rhetoric, delayed decisions, and the gradual normalization of what was once unthinkable, acknowledging that Ukraine may not win. Ukraine itself stands at the center of this reckoning. A state cannot survive indefinitely as a symbol. Nations endure through legitimacy, accountability, and the consent of their people. Endless mobilization without elections, leadership without territorial control, and diplomacy without sovereignty are not foundations for recovery. They are indicators of terminal dependence. Russia understands this dynamic. It is not rushing toward negotiation because it does not need to. The battlefield is already negotiating on its behalf. Each kilometer secured, each Ukrainian brigade exhausted, each European budget strained reduces the relevance of documents drafted in conference rooms far from the front. When the war finally ends, and it will not end on paper, it will end because the balance of power makes continuation irrational for one side. That moment is approaching, not because of diplomatic creativity, but because material limits have been reached. Zelensky's peace plan is not the beginning of peace. It is the first formal admission that Ukraine and its backers are running out of options. History will not remember this document as a roadmap to resolution. It will remember it as a signpost, the point at which illusion gave way to inevitability, and when the West, having wagered everything on a story it wanted to believe, was forced to confront a reality it no longer controls. What we are witnessing now is not a peace process in any meaningful sense of the word, but the slow-motion collapse of a narrative that was never grounded in reality to begin with. When Zelensky returned from the United States and announced that Ukraine wanted a realistic peace, his next sentence immediately exposed the contradiction. Peace is acceptable only if Russia accepts Ukraine's terms, and if not, then pressure must be applied to Moscow. That is not negotiation, that is coercion dressed up as diplomacy. It raises an unavoidable question. Either the United States has failed to impose any discipline on Kyiv at all, or Zelensky is so detached from strategic reality that he genuinely believes Russia can still be compelled to surrender at the negotiating table after nearly 4 years of war. This mindset has not changed since the beginning. It echoes the same hollow language about a just and lasting peace, endlessly repeated by Western leaders. The phrase has become meaningless because it is never applied universally. It applies only to Ukraine's preferences, never to Russia's security concerns, never to the strategic balance in Europe, and never to the actual distribution of power on the battlefield. Zelensky continues to imagine only the outcome he wants. That very delusion is what led Ukraine into catastrophe in the first place. It is worth recalling a fact that is routinely misrepresented. Russia did not claim it would take Kyiv in 3 days. That assertion came from Washington. It was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, who publicly stated that Ukraine could fall within days. The United States evacuated its embassy and offered Zelensky safe passage west. That moment mattered. At that point, there was still an opportunity to avoid a full-scale war. A negotiated settlement could have been reached before mass destruction, before the grinding attrition that would follow. It would have been humiliating for Kyiv, certainly, but it would have preserved the country. Zelensky refused. He chose ammunition over compromise. That decision has been mythologized as heroic, and in the narrow tactical sense, Ukrainian forces did fight bravely and effectively in the early stages. That is not propaganda. It is simply true. Russia entered the conflict with a single operational concept and no logistical depth for a prolonged campaign. When that plan failed, Moscow paid a heavy price and required more than a year to correct its errors. At the time, this was celebrated across the West as proof of Russia's weakness. What almost no one acknowledged was the strategic asymmetry embedded in that moment. Ukraine could not afford to win that kind of victory. Russia could. Russia had the industrial base, manpower reserves, raw materials, historical experience, and strategic patience to absorb failure and adapt. Ukraine did not. What looked like Russian weakness in 2022 was, in reality, the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately doom Ukraine's war effort. While Western audiences cheered every destroyed tank and every battlefield setback for Russia, Moscow quietly rebuilt. Production lines were expanded, training pipelines restructured, command systems corrected, and tactics revised. Russian forces learned how to counter NATO weapons in real time. They adjusted doctrine, increased force density, and accepted that this would be a long war measured in years, not news cycles. Western societies panic at prolonged conflict. Russia historically does not. The cost of that disparity is now visible. The core of Ukraine's experienced military from 2022 no longer exists. Those who carried the burden of the early fighting are largely gone. They cannot rebuild a country when the war ends, because they will never come home. Replacement troops cycle through the front at a pace that destroys cohesion and morale. Survival rates are low. The comparison with Russian force generation is not even close. And yet, Ukrainian leadership continues to speak as if it still holds leverage. Demands are made for vast demilitarized zones, European security guarantees, and conditions that no victorious power would ever accept, let alone a power that is winning. These demands do not bring peace closer. They tell Moscow that negotiations are pointless. They confirm every suspicion Russia has voiced about Western bad faith. At this stage, it is almost puzzling that Russian leadership continues to articulate diplomatic positions at all. Moscow has repeatedly stated that it was deceived in the past on NATO expansion, on European security architecture, on the basic premise that Russian concerns would ever be taken seriously. Those memories are not abstractions. They shape policy today. The one actor capable of forcing a reckoning is the United States. A determined American president could impose reality instantly. Washington still dominates NATO politically and financially. It could tell Europe to either align with the settlement or assume full responsibility for the consequences. That alone would change the entire dynamic. Instead, what we see is paralysis. Public statements are incoherent. Questions about negotiations are answered with rambling references to unrelated achievements and vague expressions of fatigue. Everyone knows people are dying. Repeating that fact is not leadership. Leadership requires direction. It requires setting boundaries. It requires telling allies what will and will not be supported. Zelensky continues to set the narrative because no one stops him. NATO officials continue to speak about victory and sacrifice because no one contradicts them. European elites cloak their strategy in moral language, but they understand perfectly well where this is heading. Many of them have already accepted the destruction of Ukraine as inevitable. What matters to them is how that destruction can be politically exploited afterward, how it can justify further militarization, higher budgets, and a permanent posture of confrontation with Russia. The United States gains nothing from this. Certain industrial interests benefit, but the country as a whole does not. The continuation of the war only deepens instability and increases the risk of direct confrontation between nuclear powers. Every step taken to prolong the conflict plants seeds for future wars. Russia remembers every deception. Every buildup is met with a counter buildup. Every hostile doctrine becomes self-fulfilling. History shows the pattern clearly. Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, Ukraine again in 2022. Each escalation followed the same logic, and each time Russia responded decisively once its red lines were crossed. That logic has not changed. The only thing that has changed is the scale of the risk. If this trajectory continues, the danger of a direct Russia-NATO clash will only grow. Once nuclear weapons enter the equation, even in a limited way, the world that exists today ends instantly, not metaphorically. Psychologically, politically, and strategically, everything changes. There is no victory after that point. Everyone loses. Avoiding that outcome requires acknowledging the catastrophic failure of Western policy over the past decade. It requires abandoning fantasies and recognizing power as it actually exists, not as it is wished to be. The longer that recognition is delayed, the higher the cost will climb for Ukraine first, but ultimately for everyone. That is where things stand. The clock is still running, but not in anyone's favor. What remains as this war grinds forward is not a mystery but a reckoning. The tragedy is not that the outcome is unclear. The tragedy is that it is painfully clear and yet still avoided. Ukraine is being consumed by a conflict it cannot win for objectives that were never realistically attainable, in service of narratives that collapse the moment they collide with material reality. History is rarely kind to illusions, and it is merciless to those who mistake moral theater for strategy. Russia has already crossed the psychological threshold that determines how wars end. It has accepted the costs, absorbed the losses, restructured its military and economy, and adapted its doctrine to the conditions of modern industrial warfare. That transition is decisive. Once a state reaches that point, time ceases to be the enemy and becomes an ally. Ukraine, by contrast, is running out of everything that matters: trained manpower, social cohesion, economic resilience, and political room to maneuver. No quantity of slogans, summits, or symbolic gestures can reverse that imbalance. Western leaders continue to speak as if repetition itself can substitute for leverage. They invoke values, freedom, and enduring peace, while avoiding the only conversation that matters: how wars actually end when one side holds escalation dominance and the other does not. Russia does not need to hurry. It does not need dramatic breakthroughs. It needs only to continue applying pressure until reality imposes itself, because reality always does. That is not cynicism. It is how power functions in the international system. The most disturbing element of this moment is not Russian resolve, but Western denial. By refusing to impose discipline on Kyiv, by encouraging maximalist rhetoric divorced from battlefield conditions, and by pretending that endless support can substitute for a viable political end state, the West is not defending Ukraine, it is exhausting it. Every month, this continues, narrows the space for compromise, and widens the scale of irreversible loss. The country being defended is steadily disappearing beneath the weight of its supposed allies' ambitions. There is still a narrow path away from catastrophe, but it requires something that has been conspicuously absent: leadership grounded in realism rather than performance. It requires acknowledging that Russia's security concerns are not propaganda inventions but enduring strategic drivers. It requires accepting that European security cannot be built on the permanent exclusion or humiliation of the largest military power on the continent. Most of all, it requires the courage to say that continuing a war with no credible path to victory is not moral, it is negligent. If that recognition does not come, the consequences will not stop at Ukraine's borders. Europe will inherit a long-term security crisis of its own making, defined by militarization, economic strain, and perpetual instability. Russia will emerge more hardened, more self-reliant, and more distrustful than before. The United States will find itself entangled in a confrontation that offers no strategic payoff and immense downside risk. And the world will move closer, step by incremental step, toward a confrontation that no one can control once it begins. Wars do not end when one side is declared righteous. They end when reality is acknowledged and acted upon. The longer that acknowledgement is delayed, the harsher the settlement becomes. Ukraine's future is being written now, not by speeches or promises, but by attrition and arithmetic. Ignoring that fact does not change it. It only ensures that the final chapter will be darker, bloodier, and more irreversible than it ever needed to be. That is the bitter truth at the heart of this conflict. And the truth, unlike rhetoric, does not negotiate.